Hi, my name is Stuart Lynch, and in this video I'd like to introduce you to TipKit, a new framework that was introduced in iOS 17. It's a great way to introduce your users to features of your app. And right at the beginning of this video, I'm going to show you the completed project so that you'll know what to expect. I love getting your feedback, so tap the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video and leave a comment below. Make sure you subscribe to the video and ring that bell to get notifications of new videos. And if you want to support my work, you can buy me a coffee. This is the third video in a series where I'm working on a simple to-do app. In the first video, I updated the app from iOS 15 to iOS 17 to take advantage of some of the new APIs and frameworks introduced at WWDC, including the observation framework. In the second video, I introduced the ContentUnavailable View to display a different screen, first if there were no to-dos, but also if there were no search results. In the first case, I even provided an action button so that the user could be directed to create their first to-do. Well, in this video, I'm going to take a different approach and introduce you to the new TipKit framework. So this is what we're going to do, just so that you can stay with me, as this is a very long video. When the app first launches, you'll see that you no longer have a button to tap to create your first to-do. Instead, you have a tip pointing to the toolbar button telling you that this is where you need to go to start and create your first tip. When I tap the button, instead of an alert that I was using in that previous version, I'm now displaying a modal sheet with a medium detent. And I have to change this because there is some incompatibility with an alert and a tip being displayed. Well, I can continue to create to-dos, but after the third to-do, I'm presented with another tip telling me that the app has swipe actions. Well, this tip is not a popover, but rather a view that's inserted where I've placed it, and it moves the rest of the UI accordingly. I can either dismiss the tip using the X, or I can complete one of the actions like this here, and I'll swipe from the leading edges to complete a task. Now, if I start and stop the app again, I see that neither of the tips have been presented. In TipKit, once a tip has been presented and either dismissed or an action taken, it will not be presented again. Well, let's create one more tip. Let me mark two more as completed. Now, when I do that, my third tip appears, and this time with a pointer down suggesting that I delete some of my completed tips. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to dismiss the tip. Now let me stop and start the app now for the third time. And this time, when I do that, I'm given my fourth tip that gives me a suggestion on how I might want to create my to-dos so that I can search and filter more effectively. And there's also a link here to learn more that when tapped takes me to a website that presumably would have more information. It doesn't now, but you get the idea. Returning the tip is still here, but I can dismiss it at any time I like. So those are the 4 tips we're going to be building, and along the way learn the essentials of TipKit and how you can implement them in your app and what to look for during your implementation. I'm going to start with the basics, and if you want to work along with me, I recommend that you download the starter project from the link in the description. As I mentioned, it is almost the same as the completed project from the last video on ContentUnavailable View, but I did have to add a new to-do view to handle the bottom sheet creation of a new to-do instead of using the alert for the purposes of this video and tips. Now, since we want to show a tip instead of the button to get the user to create a new tip, I need to go to that ContentUnavailable view and remove that new to-do action. So let's do that. Well, the first thing that we can do then is to create a tip, and I want to keep all of my tips together. So first I'm going to create a folder group, and I'm going to call it tips. Inside that folder, I'll create a new Swift file, and I'll call it create to-do tip. That's going to be my first tip. Now, in order to use TipKit, we'll need to import TipKit. Now I can create a struct called createToDoTip that conforms to the tip protocol. Now you'll be told that it doesn't conform to the tip protocol, so if you let Xcode fix it, you'll get a single title variable that is of type text. So we'll need to make this a computed property and simply return a text view like this, providing the text create your first to-do. Well, I'm going to come back to this shortly, but this is all you really need for a tip. Before we can use it, however, we'll need to initialize and tell our project to compile all tips that we have. And this is best done where your app gets initialized, which in our case is that my to-dos apps file. So first here we'll have to import TipKit, and then next, either within the onAppear block that we already have, or in an initializer, we can do our configuration. I'm going to create an initializer after the body variable, and inside here I'll simply call the tips.configure method with no options for now. And I'll come back to that a little later. Now it may throw an error, so I have to make sure that I use an optional try here. Well, now that our tip has been created, we can add it to our view. And in this case, I want to use a PopOver type tip. That will be a popover that will point directly to the toolbar button. So in the to-do list view, I'm going to create a variable to initialize our create to-do tip. Now the tip will have to be attached to our button, and we can do that using our PopOver Tip method and pass the tip instance, and then we can provide an arrow edge, and we want to do that at the top. So the tip is going to be below our button. Well, you can see that this tip is displayed now in our preview canvas, and the tip is pointing up to the plus button. Well, this is nice, but we really need to be running in a simulator so that we can do our testing properly. So let me switch to a simulator and run it. And we see that first tip displayed. Not very informative, but here it is. If I tap off the screen, the pop-up disappears. If I run the app again, it reappears. This time, let me tap the X button to dismiss the pop-up. Now let me run again. The tip no longer appears. Once you dismiss a tip, it will never be seen again, and this is not great for testing purposes. So what we can do is call a reset function before the tip gets configured. This will purge all TipKit related data, and it may fail, so we'll use again try and use the tips static reset data store function. If I run again, the tip will appear, and it will appear each time. So let's work on fixing up this tip a bit more. There are a few more properties that we can add. For example, we can add a message, but this has to be an optional text view. We'll specify tap on this button to create your first to-do. Similarly, we can add an image, but it too has to be optional. So for example, we could use a system image like hand.point.up.fill. If I run this now, that tip appears and it looks much better. Well, it doesn't have to be an SF symbol for my image. In my assets folder, I have an image called no to-dos. And in iOS 17, that gets symbolized. So instead of using a system image for our image, I'll simply use the image, and then I can use dot to take a look at all of my image assets and just choose that no to-dos. Running now, we see this to-do. So let's stop and remove our reset data store function and run once more. Let me tap on the create to-do button and create a new to-do. The tip disappears, and the modal sheet pops up where I can create my first to-do. Let me run it again. Uh-oh, that tip popped up again. Well, I already know how to create new to-dos, so I don't need to have this tip keep on appearing. And the reason is that with PopOver Tips, they dismiss themselves, but it's not the same as tapping that X button. We'll need to invalidate that tip if a new to-do is successfully created. And this happens in the new to-do view. So we'll need to pass in our tip to that view. So within the new to-do view, I'm going to create a property that I'll be able to pass in. And this I will call create to-do tip. That will be a create to-do tip instance. We'll also need to add an instance in the preview to stop it from complaining. Now for the action after we call the data store function to add the new to-do, we can call the create to-do tips invalidate function and pass in a reason, which is an enum case, and we'll use action performed. And then finally, back in our to-do list view, we'll need to make sure that we pass in our instance when we present this sheet. If I run now, that tip is still there, but let me create a new one. And then if I stop and start the app, and you'll see that tip no longer appears, and it will never get presented to the user again. For our second tip, I want to show you how you can set a rule for when a tip will get displayed. For new users, it's not clear how one would mark a to-do to be completed, or indeed delete. I know how to do this, but your users might not. So let's create a new tip for that. Inside the tip folders, create a new Swift file and call it Swipe Action Tip. When the file opens, import TipKit. We'll create a struct with the same name and conform it to the tip protocol. We'll conform to that protocol by creating a title variable, that's that text view, and we'll add the text Swipe Actions. I'll want a message as well, and that's that optional text view. And for that, we can create a two-line text view. The first line being swipe from the leading edge to mark as completed. And then we use a \n to start a new line. And then for the second line, we can simply say swipe from the trailing edge to delete. And then for our image, I'll use that same no to-dos image again. Well, with TipKit, we can create events for our tips that can track an action that can occur one or more times in our app. So for example, we want to track the number of times someone creates a new to-do, and then after the third time, give them a tip on how to mark it as completed or how to delete it. This event then is created as a static property in our tip. So for us, that's our swipe action tip. So I'll create a new variable, static variable called swipe action event, and create an event where the ID is simply a string, and I'll make that the same as our variable name. Next, we can create a rule based on the number of times that this event has occurred. So when an action occurs in our code, we're going to call a donate function that essentially records the date and time that that action took place. This means we should be able to either count the number of donations to this event or check the last time that that action took place and respond accordingly. Well, a tip has another property that's called rules. That is an array of these rules. In TipKit, I'm a bit confused. I don't understand why this is the case, because since this is an array of rules, you would think that you would need square brackets to enclose our rule. In fact, if we left out our square brackets, Xcode wouldn't complain and it would compile just fine. It must have something to do with the fact that the array is an empty array by default. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I'm going to start always with an array when I have an array. To create a rule, we use the rule macro. And you see that we have two different types that we can use. There's an event-based one and a parameter one. I'm going to use the event-based one now, and I'll show you the parameter next. The macro requires that we provide the event, which is our static property, so self.swipeActionEvent. And then the body needs to be a trailing closure, where we can check for the number of donations or the date of each donation. We just want to know the count, the number of donations, and return a comparison to greater than or equal to 3, so it'll return true if the action has taken place 3 or more times. Remember, once an event has been invalidated, this rule will no longer be checked, even if it gathers more donations. Well, this tip appears in our to-do list, so I need to create an instance of it here. Now, I don't want to see the canvas anymore here, though, as it's distracting. So I'm going to be testing on our device. So let me just get rid of it. I want this tip, though, to be inline and not a popover. And I want this to be at the top of our list. So before the for each loop, I'll create a tip view and simply pass in that tip. Of course, we'll need to import TipKit because we're presenting the tip here. Remember, our popover was occurring in the new to-do view, and we had imported it there already. We'll need to create that donate action, but that's going to be happening in our new to-do view. So we'll have to pass on this swipe action tip to that new to-do view in our sheet when it's presented. So now let's go to that new to-do view and create that property that will come from that list view. And then to stop our preview from complaining again, we'll have to add that instance there as well. Well, each time we create a new to-do, we'll have to call that donate method that I referred to, and that's an asynchronous function. So within the button action, I'm going to create a task unit of work, and within here, I'll await the result of calling that static swipe action tips, swipe action events, donate method. Well, if the user doesn't tap the dismiss button, this will continue to be displayed. So instead of invalidating the event when I swipe or delete, I'm going to provide an option for this rule that will only ever display once, and then it will invalidate itself. So back in our swipe action tip, I'm going to create another property that will be options, and that's an array of options. And what I want to call is the tips static max display count function and specify 1 only. So this tip will only ever display once and then self-invalidate. Well, let me run this in the simulator then. You'll not see any tips yet. Now I'm going to delete these 2 here and create some more from scratch. Still no tips. Still none after 2. However, when I create that third one, I get that inline tip telling me what to do. Now I'm not going to close this tip though, I'm just going to run it once more. Now normally this would have meant that our tip had not been invalidated. But since we added that rule, it's been invalidated and that tip will no longer display. Well, before I go on to this next tip, let me just fix this typo here on my swipe action tip. It's not a swip action, it's a swipe action. Well, the next rule I want to create is one that uses a parameter-based rule. And that rule will be that when I have at least 3 completed to-dos in my list, I want to suggest that people start deleting them. So within the tips folder, I'm going to create a new Swift file, and I'm going to call it completion to delete tip. When the file opens, I'll import TipKit, and then I'll create a struct using the same name that conforms to the tip protocol. I'll create the compulsory title variable as a text view, and for the text view, I'll display the string time to clean up. I'll create a message var, which is that optional text view, and use the string start swiping from the trailing edge to delete completed to-dos. Then I'm going to create an image, and this time I'll use a system image of trash. Well, this is not going to be an event-based tip, rather one based on a parameter. So we'll need to use the parameters macro, but no need for any options. With that designated, we'll create a static property for this rule that I will call reached threshold parameter as a Boolean, and it will initialize as false. This is going to be changed by our code to initiate the display of the rule. So when we create our rule, it will have to be a binding to this property. So I'm going to create the rules variable. Again, that's that array of rule. And I'm going to use that rule macro again, but we're going to choose the parameter-based one and choose self to access the static property. And we see indeed there's a $sign there to indicate that we can change it. And this will provide us with our var that we can call parameter, which represents our Boolean reached threshold parameter. So we can simply return true when it's equal to true. Now, since this parameter is used in a single line in the body, we could choose to use a shortcut notation with $0 and remove the parameter in altogether. Now we'll need to go to our data store and create a computed property that will provide us with the count of the number of to-dos that have been completed. This is pretty easy. We'll create the completed to-dos count as a computed variable that'll be an int, and it will simply return the result of using our to-dos array filtered by those that are completed count. Now we have everything we need to implement our rule. This can be done in the to-do list view. So I'm going to start by creating a completion to delete tip instance. Well, this tip I want to have displayed above the list, so just above that, create an inline tip view and pass it in, but also include an arrow edge of bottom. Well, each time we swipe to complete, we can check to see if the data store's completed to-dos count is greater than or equal to 3. If it is, then we can set the static property for the completion to delete tip reached threshold parameter to true, and then this will present the tip. Well, I want to invalidate the tip immediately, however, so I'm going to create an onChange modifier after I set the list style and watch for changes on the data store's completed to-dos count. Well, this gives me access to the old value and the new value now in iOS 17. Well, I can check to see if the old value was greater than or equal to 3, which will be our case. And then if that new value after deletion is less than 3, then I can invalidate the completion to delete tip with the action performed reason. So let me run in the simulator and let me complete 3 to-dos. As soon as all 3 are completed, that tip appears, pointing down, telling me to start deleting. As soon as I delete 1, the tip disappears, and it's been invalidated. If I run again and complete another one, that tip no longer appears. What I want to do now, though, is stylize that tip a bit. But the problem is that it's been invalidated. So I could go back to the initializer and uncomment out that reset data store method, but that would set me back and force me to go through the other tip as well. Well, there is another method that I can use, and that's the show tips for testing method. And that accepts an array of tip type to display in an array. So I'm just going to pass in the completion to do tip.self. That's the only one that it's basically going to show every time. Well, there are a couple of places that I can go to stylize the tip. First of all, the tip itself. And I can stylize this text view just as I can any other text view. So I'm going to make it italics. I'm going to enlarge the font to set it to a style of title. And then I'm going to set the foreground style to be red. And then I'm going to go where I present the tip for that tip view. And here I'm going to apply a tip background method. And I'm going to apply a color of red with an opacity of 0.2. I also want that trash can to be red instead of blue as well, so I'm going to apply a tint color of red to the tip view. And to bring it in from the sides, I'm going to add some padding. Now when I run the app, we do see that tip, and it appears with that styling. Perfect. Well, I know that this tip works, so I don't need to test it anymore. I can go back to my initializer then and comment out this temporary testing display. Before I leave this though, let me just mention that there are 3 other methods that might come in handy. So let me just first fix this typo. And I'll paste in the remaining methods. This first one is just like the previous one, except that it will hide a specific set of tips. And then the remaining 2 will let you either show all or hide all tips. The last tip that I want to cover is one that will present an action link. Well, for this tip, once the user has opened the app and displayed our to-do list view at least 4 times, I want to give them a tip on how to improve filtering. This tip will be an event-based tip that we can donate to each time the view appears. So in the tips folder, I'm going to create a new Swift file that I'll call filter tip. And you know the routine. We'll import TipKit and then create a struct of the same name that conforms to the tips protocol. And then for the title, I'm going to create a text view, search, and filter with tags. For the optional message text view, we'll use start your to-dos with a word surrounded by brackets, like work, so you can effectively filter your to-do list. And then for the image, I'm going to use a system image of tag.fill. Well, I'm also going to introduce a new property called actions. That's an array of action. Well, each action requires an ID and a title that will represent a clickable link on the tip. So I'll use the string learn more for the ID. And then for the title of the link, I'll use learn more, 2 words. Next, we'll create that static event. So I'm going to call mine show filter tip event. And that will be an event where the ID will use the same name as the variable. Now that we have that, we can establish our rules. So the rule will be an event-based rule for the self show filter tip event. And I'm going to return true only if the event, the $0 donations count, is greater than or equal to 4. So somehow we have to donate to this tip each time that view appears. So let's go to our to-do list view right now and set up our tip. First, we'll create an instance of the filter tip. Now the link for the action is going to open a URL. So I'm going to create another environment variable for OpenURL. And I'm going to call it OpenURL. That's going to make it easy for me to create a link. Now for the tip view. So below the completion to-dos tip, I'm going to create a new tip view, but I'm going to include the arrow edge and action arguments. The tip, of course, will be our filter tip. And for the arrow edge, I'll set to bottom. And then the action's a trailing closure that'll give us an instance of any actions that the tip has. Well, ours only has 1, but there could have been several. So we can check for the action's ID and compare it to the one which was learn-more. If that's the case, we can call the OpenURLs method passing in the URL that we want to open. So I'm going to provide a string that will go to my website where I might have more information on this topic. And now we have to make a donation to this tip every time this view appears. And remember that it's an asynchronous call to that static event method. So instead of on appear, I'm going to use an task and then await the call to the static's filter tips show filter tip events donate function. Well, I'm not going to invalidate this tip at all. So it's going to force the user to actually close the tip off if they don't ever want to see it again. So let me first run this 4 times now. The first 3 times the tip doesn't appear. But on the 4th launch, it does. And we can tap on that link on the tip and it'll open Safari on the device and go to that URL. When I return and I no longer want to see that link, I'll need to invalidate the tip by closing it. I have one more thing I want to finish here, and that is to go back to our initializer where we configure our tips. We use this configure without any arguments, but we can add some, if I like, as an array of options. Well, there's an array to set the data store's location, and the default is the application default. But if you're sharing tips over iCloud, then you'll want to use the other option. Then the other one is the display frequency, which is defaulting to immediate. However, if you have a lot of tips, you might not want this. You can see that we have a number of options to choose from. For example, there's hourly or monthly or daily. If we change this, it means that you'll only be presented with 1 tip at a time until the next time period. So let's choose daily for demonstration purposes. So let me go back to the simulator and delete the app so that there's no history at all left. Now I'm going to run the app for the first time, and I get that first tip as I would expect. So let me add a bunch of to-dos. Once I've met or exceeded 3, my second swipe action event should have triggered that tip to have shown, but we are only showing 1 tip a day, so this tip won't appear until tomorrow. Well, I can override that though on individual tips, however, by adding another option to that particular tip, and that's my swipe action tip. So for this, I'm going to use the tips ignore display frequency and simply pass in true. So then that will force it to be immediate instead of daily. Now, when I run this app, because I had 4 tips already, that tip is presented, but the other rule will ensure that it will only display once. Well, that's about it for this video, and I hope that I've covered everything that you'd like to know about TipKit. I think I've covered the essentials, if not more, for implementing TipKit in your app. Be sure to dig into the documentation to check out the other options available. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment below. And be sure to subscribe to my channel and ring the bell to get notifications as new videos are released. Your comments and thumbs up help drive more to my channel. Thanks for watching.